Hal Brener had spent the last 5 years without speaking to another soul. After burying his wife and daughter in a patch of sunburnt land behind the barn, he turned inward like the door he kept bolted each night. The ranch had become a hollow rhythm of chores and silence, just the creak of the rocking chair, the groan of the barn gate, the occasional rustle of wind through the brittle grass. So when he heard the knock, soft and uncertain against the wood of his front door, he thought it might be his mind playing tricks. It wasn't the kind of knock meant to demand or even announce. It was hesitant, 2 light taps like a question asked too quietly. Hal stood in the kitchen, hand still on the kettle, heart suddenly loud in his chest. Another knock, just as small, just as unsure. For a long moment, he didn't move. Visitors didn't come out this far. Strangers certainly didn't, and no one who'd ever known him before had bothered since the day of the funeral. Still, he found his hand drifting toward the doorknob, not by decision but by some slow, reluctant force inside him that he thought had died long ago. He opened the door. There, in the dimming twilight, stood a girl. She couldn't have been older than 7. Barefoot, knees scraped raw, a thin dress clung to her too small frame, and her arms cradled what looked like a bundle but turned out to be a worn cloth doll. Her hair was tangled, full of dust and leaves, and her eyes, those wide brown eyes, searched his face not for hope, but for a place to land her fear. Hal couldn't speak. His hand froze on the doorframe. "My mama died today," she said, voice like cracked glass. "Can I stay here just one night?" She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She didn't even move, just stood there, like she already expected to be turned away. Rehearsed it in her head so many times that rejection had become muscle memory. Her small body was trembling, but she didn't seem to notice it anymore. And Hal was looking at a ghost. Not her, exactly, but something about her. The way she gripped the doll. The way she stared straight ahead like she didn't want to need anything. It clawed open a part of him he'd sealed shut with dirt and grief 5 winters ago. His voice came out lower and rougher than he intended. "The bunks got blankets." That was all he could manage. That was all she needed. She stepped inside quietly, her bare feet making no sound against the wooden floor. She didn't look around. She didn't ask questions. She moved with the kind of stillness that comes from too much caution, like if she breathed too loudly, the world might remember she existed and take something else from her. She set the doll gently on the bench by the fire, smoothed its blanket, then sat cross-legged on the floor just beside it. She didn't ask for food, didn't reach for water. She just sat there, her shoulders pulled in tight, as if trying to take up less space in the world. Hal stood behind his old rocking chair, unsure what to do with his hands, his voice, or his thoughts. He couldn't stop staring. This girl, this trembling child who spoke of death without emotion and of shelter with a kind of borrowed bravery. She was both foreign and familiar. It wasn't that he saw his daughter in her face. It was that he saw her in the silence, the absence, the restraint. "You got a name?" he asked finally. She didn't look at him when she answered. "Marne. Mama said if anything happened, I should find a man with kind eyes and no ring on his finger." She pointed to his left hand. Hal blinked. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "You been walking long?" She nodded. "From where the smoke was this morning?" Again, she nodded. Hal's stomach sank. He had seen it earlier that day. A thin column of gray on the horizon. He'd told himself it was nothing. He didn't go. He never went anymore. Better to keep to himself. Safer that way. And now he wished he'd gone. Now he hated the part of himself that had chosen quiet over courage. Marne curled up near the fire, her head resting on her arm, the doll tucked close to her chest. She closed her eyes without asking if it was okay. Like she already knew it was temporary. Like she'd already calculated how fast she could leave if she had to. Hal watched her for a long time. Her chest rose and fell in a rhythm that didn't quite match rest. It was more like defense. Like even in sleep, She wasn't sure the world wouldn't snatch the floor out from under her. He didn't know why he said it, not even to himself. Maybe it was just that the silence had grown too loud again. Or maybe it was the way the doll's head rested so perfectly in the crook of her elbow. Like it had always belonged there. "You can stay the night," he muttered. Then after a beat, "You can stay." She didn't hear him. She was already asleep. But Hal didn't sleep at all that night. He sat in the rocking chair, boots still on, watching the girl by the fire, watching the way her face softened just slightly in rest. He stared at the name she'd given him. Marne, like the river, like a memory. Outside, the wind shifted through the trees, carrying dust and silence across the dry land. Inside, the fire crackled low, casting long shadows over old wood and new chants. Hal didn't move, but something in him did. Something he hadn't let move in years. The morning after she arrived, Marne didn't ask what would happen next. She didn't ask if she could stay longer or if he would take her back to town. Instead, she woke before the sun had fully risen, pulled the doll close, and sat cross-legged by the hearth as if she had always belonged there. Hal Brener, still unsure how to talk to a child he hadn't known 2 days ago, poured 2 cups of water and placed one gently in front of her. She gave a small nod. Not thanks exactly, but acknowledgement. Then, without a word, she reached under the blanket wrapped around her doll and pulled out an object he hadn't noticed before. A journal. Worn, cracked leather hugged its bent corners. The edges of the pages were frayed, stained, and faded. A few petals were pressed between them, fragile and yellowing, marking places once important. Marne held it like it was sacred. She placed it gently on her lap and opened it to a familiar page. "My mama wrote every night," she said quietly. She said words keep the soul from rotting. Hal didn't move. His coffee grew cold in his hand. His eyes were fixed on the book. It was her mother's, Eleonora's, a woman he never knew, now reaching across time and ash to speak through ink. "She wrote this one last week," Marne whispered. Then, slowly, she began to read aloud. "Marne smiled today when I sang the song Daddy used to hum. She pretended not to, but I saw it." Her lip quivered, but she didn't stop. "Tomorrow I'll trade eggs for milk. I think Marne misses sugar. If anything happens to me, I hope she finds someone with kind eyes. Not perfect, just kind." Marne paused and looked up. "Is that you?" Hal couldn't answer. His throat closed. He hadn't felt anything that strong in years. And it hit him like a wave, unexpected, unrelenting, real. "I used to be," he said finally, voice barely above a rasp. Marne nodded as if that answer made sense. She flipped to another page, one with dried wildflowers pressed into the crease. "This one's about when we left the last town. Mama said people didn't like women who asked too many questions." Hal winced. He'd known women like that, sharp, smart, too alive for the small towns that swallowed light and spit back silence. And he'd seen how quickly those women were broken by men with louder voices and smaller hearts. "What happened to her?" he asked quietly. Marne didn't answer right away. She looked down at her doll, then back at the journal. She started coughing. Then she couldn't breathe. "I sang to her, but she didn't wake up." Her voice trembled, and Hal saw it then, the unbearable weight behind her eyes. A child carrying grief so heavy it shaped her shoulders before they had a chance to grow. "So I walked." That was all she said. 4 words that echoed in the stillness like a bell. Hal turned away. He couldn't look at her. Couldn't look at the girl who had buried her mother with her bare hands and carried nothing but a doll and a journal to find someone with kind eyes. He wanted to say he was sorry, but sorry felt small, empty. "You read good," he said instead, too gruffly. "She taught me," Marne replied. "I used to read to her at night. Now I read to remember." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't heavy. It was careful. Then, she did something that undid him completely. She closed the journal and held it out to him. "You can write too," she said. "Mama said even quiet men need somewhere to bleed." Hal stared at the journal, his hand hovering like it might burn him. He didn't take it, not yet, but he rested his fingers on the cover, feeling the soft wear of the leather, the warmth of 1,000 quiet thoughts soaked into the pages. She didn't push him, she just placed the pencil beside the journal and went to feed the mule. Hal sat there for a long time. He opened the journal to the page Marne had read aloud and reread the lines slowly. "If anything happens to me, I hope she finds someone with kind eyes." He closed his eyes and inhaled. That night, Marne hummed a song by the fire. Off-key, soft, and familiar. Hal froze. He knew that tune. His wife used to hum it. Years ago, barefoot on the porch, flowers braided in their daughter's hair. It was a lullaby passed down like family silver, worn but unbroken. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked, sharper than intended. Marne paused. "Mama said her papa learned it from a man on horseback who cried when he sang." Hal swallowed. That song was older than war, older than sorrow, older than the fences he mended every day. And somehow, this little girl, this stranger, had brought it back into his home. Back into his ears, back into the part of him that still remembered what hope sounded like. He didn't say anything more that night, but before bed, Marne handed him the journal again, this time open to a blank page. "You don't have to say much," she whispered. "Mama said even one sentence counts." He hesitated. Then slowly, he took the pencil. His hand shook. The words came out jagged, uneven, but they came. "She shouldn't be alone." Marne leaned over. "Read it," and nodded solemnly. She didn't praise him. She didn't clap. She just folded the journal shut like it was now complete. Then she leaned her head against his arm and whispered, "Mama would have liked you." Hal didn't move, but inside, a door long sealed cracked just enough to let a little light in. And as the fire flickered low and the journal rested on the table between them, he realized something else. He wasn't reading a stranger's words. He was being handed a legacy. Not by blood, but by trust. And it was his turn to carry it forward. Hal hadn't meant to go back. He'd told himself the smoke was behind them now, that what burned was gone, and there was no sense digging through ruins for something the fire hadn't spared. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was in her voice that first night. The way she said it, "My mama died today." Like she'd rehearsed the words over and over, until they didn't even sound like pain anymore. Like she'd buried the grief so deep, it took silence to carry it. So Hal hitched the mule cart at dawn, told Marne they were going to town for salt. She didn't question him. She didn't ask why he packed extra water or why his eyes didn't meet hers. She knew. The land turned drier as they rode. Grass gave way to dust, then to scorched earth, and finally, the charred skeleton of what had once been a cabin appeared like a ghost on the horizon. Blackened beams jutting from the soil like broken ribs. Hal pulled the cart to a stop. Marne slid down without waiting to be told. She clutched her doll tighter, walking ahead with slow, deliberate steps until she reached a small patch of disturbed earth. No cross, no marker, just a mound, and a stone. "She's here," she whispered, like a greeting. Hal followed, removing his hat as he approached the grave. Something in his chest pulled tight. Grief maybe. Or guilt. Or something worse. Recognition. "You buried her?" he asked. Marne nodded. "With my hands. Took all day." She didn't cry. She didn't need to. The dirt caked under her nails. The tired set of her shoulders. The way she touched the stone like it was still warm. Those told the whole story. She always said, "Don't leave the dead to the birds." Hal knelt beside the mound. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached into his coat and pulled something out. A silver spoon. Tarnished but solid. It was the last of his wife's set. The only thing he'd kept when he gave the rest away after the funeral. He ran a thumb across its surface. "This belonged to someone I loved," he said, "and now it belongs here." He placed it beside the rock, half buried it into the soil like planting something. Marne stared. "That was yours." Hal shook his head. Was hers. My wife. She'd have wanted it to go to someone like your mama. Marne didn't say thank you. She just sat next to the grave and began to hum her mother's song. Slow and off-key, but soft like prayer. And Hal did something he hadn't done in years. He hummed with her. That night, thunder rolled across the hills. Storm coming, the kind that rattled window panes and tugged at the shutters. But Hal wasn't afraid. The roof held, the barn was dry, and for the first time in a long while, someone else was asleep beneath that roof. Marne had curled up near the hearth again, her doll cradled in one arm, the journal tucked under her other. Hal sat by the window, watching the wind comb the grass outside. He couldn't stop seeing the grave, that mound of earth, that child kneeling beside it like it was an altar. He thought he'd buried his own fatherhood with his wife and daughter. But it had only gone quiet, dormant, and now, somehow, it had started to breathe again. Hal walked out to the barn, sat on an overturned crate in the hay, hands shaking. He hadn't prayed in years. Not since he'd lowered 2 coffins into the same hole and decided no God worth his salt would let that happen. But now, if she's meant to stay, Hal whispered into the shadows, then help me not mess it up. That's all he could say. Then the barn door creaked. Marne stood in the doorway, barefoot and muddy. She held the journal in one hand like it was a lantern. You okay? She asked. Hal wiped at his eyes. Couldn't sleep. She walked over, sat beside him without asking, opened the journal to a blank page. Then right. He shook his head. Ain't got much to say. Mama said 1 sentence is enough. She offered the pencil, and Hal took it. His hand trembled, but the words came. She shouldn't be alone. Marne read it, didn't smile, just nodded, like something had been settled. Then she leaned her head against his arm and said, Mama would have liked you. He didn't move, didn't breathe, just sat in the dark barn with a child against his side and a journal in his lap. And felt something inside him uncoil. The next morning, Hal didn't wake early. It was Marne's humming that stirred him, gentle, steady, floating in from the kitchen like sunlight. She was at the stove, barefoot, brow furrowed as she stirred the pot. Tried not to burn it. She said, didn't have sage, so I used pepper. He blinked. She'd set the table, 2 tin cups, a rough-looking cornbread, a folded cloth napkin in the center, with a stone on top like a flower vase. You cooked? She nodded proudly. Listened to you yesterday, and you talk in your sleep. I do not. You do. You said, dang chickens. He chuckled despite himself. She sat down across from him, hands folded. Mama always prayed before meals. He hesitated. I haven't prayed in a long time. That's okay, she said. I will. And she hummed the song again. No words. Just the tune. It filled the silence like a blessing. Later that day, Hal watched as she took a piece of chalk and wrote her name, Marne, on the porch beam. Just beneath the faded name of his daughter, Sarah. He didn't stop her. Didn't say a word. Just stepped beside her, placed a hand over both names, and whispered, Welcome home. No promises. No paperwork. Not yet. But in every step, every offering, every word he didn't say, Hal made his choice. She was his. Not by blood, but by the most sacred kind of bond. By choice. It had been over 4 years since Hal Brener walked into the town of Red Hollow. 4 years since the funeral. 4 years since he'd shaken a single hand, looked anyone in the eye, or crossed the dusty line between solitude and society. But that Sunday morning, he saddled the mule and folded the old quilt with care. Then, without a word, he reached for Marne's hand and said, We're going to church. Her fingers slipped into his. Small but steady. She didn't ask why. She knew. They walked down the aisle together, past rows of wooden pews and curious stares, her doll tucked under one arm, a document folded in her pocket, and a fire in Hal's chest he hadn't felt since the day he became a father. The preacher stopped mid-hymn. You could have heard a pin drop on the church floor. Hal nodded once, Firm. We're not here for show. We're here for truth. Marne's grip tightened, but she didn't falter. She walked beside him with her head high, though her bottom lip quivered ever so slightly. She'd only ever seen this place from the outside. Her mother, Eleonora, used to hum near the doors, never going in, always afraid of what silence might answer. Now, her daughter stood in the front pew. Hal took off his hat. The preacher cleared his throat and motioned for the choir to continue, as if restarting time. But nothing felt the same after Hal Brener showed up again, with a child no one recognized and eyes that dared them to look away. After the final hymn, murmurs began in the back. Is that the girl from the fire? That him? The one who just vanished? Is she his? Hal turned around slowly. His voice was low, but the room felt it like thunder. I have something to return. He held up the quilt, hand-stitched, faded but beautiful, every square a story told in thread. This belonged to a woman named Eleonora. Most of you never knew her name. Some of you saw her in town, sitting in the back pew. Never said a word. No one ever asked. A flush rose on the face of a woman in the second row. She looked down. Hal continued. She came more than once, hoping, I think, to be seen, to be heard, but no one did. Not until she was gone. Not until her daughter knocked on my door. He looked down at Marne, whose chin was set like stone, her eyes daring the silence to try her again. This child, he said, is mine now. Gasps rustled like wind through the pews. Not by blood, Hal said, but by choice, by every quiet morning and every song she sings when she thinks I'm not listening. By the way she reads her mama's journal out loud and lays out supper with both plates. Even when I forget. Marne blinked quickly, but no tears fell. She'd done enough crying in the ash and smoke. This moment was for standing tall. She belongs to no one else, and she will never be left behind again. The preacher stepped forward, soft-voiced but solemn. You filed the papers? Hal reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the envelope. Inside was the guardianship grant, signed by the circuit judge 2 towns over. She's mine in every way the law knows how, Hal said. The preacher nodded. Then Hal added, voice tight, and for the record, her mama was a good woman. Strong, brave, she deserved more than whispers and turned backs. He looked across the room. I won't let the same thing happen to her daughter. Marne stood up straighter, her doll still tucked under her arm, quilt pressed against her chest like armor. A young boy in the aisle seat leaned forward and whispered, you can sit by me next Sunday. She blinked at him. Okay, she said softly. The room shifted. A woman in the back stood and brought forward a loaf of bread. Another offered shoes, guessing the girl's size by eye. An older man tipped his hat and muttered, takes a good man to raise someone else's child. Hal didn't respond. He just kept his hand on Marne's shoulder, steady and proud, as the warmth of acknowledgement slowly filled the space that had once been hollow. When they stepped outside, the church bell rang behind them. This time, it didn't sound empty. That afternoon, back at the ranch, Hal handed Marne a small nail and watched as she knelt beside the porch beam. The chalk name Sarah had faded over time, his daughter, long gone but never forgotten. Now, right beneath it, she wrote Marne. 2 names, side by side, not competing, not replacing, just belonging. Hal stood beside her, one hand on the wood, the other on her back. You sure you want it there? He asked. She nodded. Mama said a name written with care can hold more weight than a tombstone. She stepped back. The wind caught her hair, brushing it across her face. Hal looked at the names again. He didn't say I love you. He didn't say you're mine. He didn't have to. Instead, he bent down and whispered beneath them both, welcome home. That evening, they sat together on the porch, the quilt across both laps. Marne hummed a new version of her mother's lullaby, changing a few words, adding Hal's name, rhyming it with Pal. It didn't quite fit, it didn't quite rhyme, but Hal laughed anyway, because it was hers, and he was hers. And that was enough. For the first time in 5 years, he left the porch light on. Not for strangers, not for ghosts, but for anyone who'd ever been turned away at a closed door, and needed to know. It opens now. The days began to take on rhythm. Not the cold, routine kind that Hal Brener had known for years, the lonely cadence of chores, silence, and shadows, but something warmer, softer, like the beat of a heart that had once slowed and was now learning to thump again. Marne brought that change. She didn't mean to, she didn't ask for it, but the way she quietly swept the floor after breakfast, lined the windowsills with pine cones, or set out 2 mugs even when Hal forgot, it created something steady and alive between them. And Hal, for all his years and calloused hands, started to move differently too. He repaired the fence not just because it needed fixing but because he knew Marne would follow him out there, skipping every third step and humming under her breath. He sharpened the kitchen knives, not for himself, but because she liked chopping carrots with precision. He even began leaving the back door open in the early evenings so she could chase fireflies barefoot in the yard without having to knock to come back in. One late afternoon, as golden light slid across the porch and the air smelled of wood smoke and laundry soap, Hal sat in his usual chair with his coffee in hand. He watched Marne walk over with a piece of chalk in her palm and a look of quiet determination on her face. She didn't say a word, just stood by the porch beam, the one near the door where, years ago, Hal had written his daughter's name, Sarah, in thick, careful letters. That name had been untouched since the day he etched it there. The chalk had faded, but Hal never rubbed it away. He never added anything beside it either. Until now. Marne looked at him, seeking silent permission. Hal gave the smallest of nods. So she stepped forward, knelt beside Sarah's name, and wrote, Marne. 2 names, side by side, neither replacing the other, just belonging. She stood back, dusted her hands, and looked at the beam like it was a page in a story she had just been written into. Hal swallowed hard. He approached, crouched beside the chalked letters, and ran his finger beneath both names. Then, in a voice rough with memory but light with something new, he whispered, Welcome home. That evening, they ate stew by lantern light. Marne had insisted on using the special tin cups even though they were dented and mismatched. She placed a smooth stone in the middle of the table as a centerpiece, said it looked like a sleeping dog. Though Hal didn't quite see it. Still, he didn't argue. When they finished, she unwrapped the quilt and pulled out the little tin box her mother had left behind. Inside were folded letters, dried flowers, and now a new addition, the guardianship paper Hal had brought home from town. She looked up at him. Where should we keep it? Hal thought for a moment, then walked to the mantel and cleared a space between 2 faded photos. He set the box there gently, like it was made of glass. This house has seen enough forgetting, he said. Time it remembers something good. That night, Hal did something he hadn't done in years. He turned on the porch light. Not because someone was coming, but because someone already had, and stayed. The warm bulb glowed against the dark, casting a golden halo across the steps. Marne came to stand beside him, barefoot again, a blanket draped over her shoulders like a cape. You never turned that on before, she said. No reason to. She leaned against his side. Now you do? He nodded. Now I do. They stood there a while, the silence between them no longer empty, just comfortable. In the weeks that followed, the house filled with small things that made it feel like a home again. Marne pinned pressed flowers to the window frames. Hal found himself humming while washing dishes. They built a shelf together, lopsided but sturdy, and filled it with the few books they had. She started singing out loud more, not just humming. Sometimes she'd change the lyrics of her mother's songs, sneaking in new verses about fence posts and mules, about men who talk in their sleep and girls who cook with too much pepper. They were terrible songs. Hal loved them. One night, after Marne had gone to bed, Hal sat by the fire with the journal in his lap. He turned to the last page again, the one with Eleanor's final words. If she makes it out, let her keep her songs. She doesn't need much, just space to sing and someone who won't make her feel like a ghost. Hal stared at the lines. He thought about the way Marne sang while feeding the chickens. The way she laughed when her stew boiled over. The way she drew stick figures on the porch, one in a big hat, one with a doll, and said, "That's us." He picked up the pencil, turned to the blank page beneath Eleanor's final entry, and added one line. She sings louder now, and I do, too. Then he closed the journal, left it on the table, for whatever came next to see. That weekend, Marne took a piece of string and tied it from one porch post to the other. Then she clipped tiny drawings to it with clothespins, each one a snapshot of their new life. The mule with a grin, a crooked barn, a man with a wide hat and tired eyes, a girl with wild hair and a big heart. She showed him one in particular, a drawing of a house with warm light pouring from the windows, stick figures sitting by a fire, and a heart drawn over the roof. "What's this one called?" Hal asked. Marne smiled. "Ours." And Hal, without hesitation, replied, "Yeah, that's what I'd call it, too."